There's this parable in the New Testament that just came to mind. I'm going to mangle it a bit because it's not one that I have well memorized, and I'm probably going to conflate 2 or 3 stories together, but I think I've got it right. Christ is walking down the road and someone picks him up, and the person is rich and like wealthy, and he has a talk. They have a talk, and the wealthy man basically tells him all the things that are wrong with his life, and then he asks him what he should do about it, and Christ says to him, you have to give up everything you own and follow me. And that's often been read as a criticism of wealth, and that's actually not what the story means. What the story means is this guy has a lot of wealth, but he's still miserable, and so that means that what he has is the obstacle to what he could be. And so that's the message of the story, is that if you're miserable with what you have, then you have to let go of what you have so that maybe you could have something else. And then there's some commentary on that story. I think other people are listening and they say, well, if that's the price to be paid, then no one is ever going to pay it. And I think that's where the statement, it is easier for a man to go through the eye of a needle, for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter paradise. I believe that's the derivation of that story. And like I said, that's been read as a critique of wealth, but it isn't. It's a critique of attachment. Now, you know, in the Buddhist doctrine, one of the impediments to enlightenment is attachment. And people read that as saying, well, you shouldn't care for anything in the world. And there's a nihilism that's associated with that. And there is a strong nihilistic tendency in Buddhism that has to do with abandonment of the world. You see that in Christianity to some degree, with people going off to lead ascetic lives, and it's part of multiple religious traditions, that idea of asceticism, and there's some utility in it if it is your attachment, say, to material things or status or whatever that's interfering with your psychological progression. Now, the idea is that you should let go of whatever it is that's interfering with your psychological progression, because no matter how valuable what it is that's interfering is, it's not as valuable as what you're giving up. Okay. However, the criticism still stands, and the criticism was, well, if the task is that difficult, then no one's going to do it. And so in the brothers Karamazov, there's a famous story called The Grand Inquisitor, and it's a story told by Ivan Karamazov to his brother Alyosha. And Ivan is a very high status, intelligent, attractive, tough-minded soldier. And Alyosha is his younger brother, and he's kind of softer and less rational, more spiritual, and also training to be a novitiate at the local monastery. And Ivan likes to tear strips off him because he's a cynic and an atheist, and in Dostoevsky's normal, brilliant manner, he makes Ivan an incredibly powerful, articulate, and admirable character. So when Dostoevsky wants to take someone on in his literary investigations, he doesn't take his enemy and turn him into some sort of weak puppet. He takes his enemy and turns him into the strongest possible enemy he can imagine, and then goes to battle against that. It's a hallmark of great literature. It's what distinguishes Dostoevsky, for example, from Ayn Rand. Because what Ayn Rand does is she takes she's a darling of the, I would say, libertarian/right. She takes her enemies, and they're all the same. First of all, every single one of her negative characters is exactly the same as every other one, and they're all bad. You know, there's no redeeming qualities whatsoever in them. And they also, I would say, they're weak characters who make weak arguments. That's not the way to progress. The way to progress is to take your enemy seriously, and to even inflate them into something beyond their capacity to inflate themselves, and then see if you can hammer out a solution to the genuine problem that's being posed. Anyway, so Dostoevsky does that brilliantly, always, and that's what makes him so absolutely remarkable. But anyways, Ivan tells Alyosha this story. He calls it the Grand Inquisitor, and in the story, Christ comes back to earth in the Spanish Inquisition, and he's out by a fountain, and people sort of notice him, and he starts performing miracles, and a big crowd gathers around, and it's like happy days, you know. But then the Inquisitor shows up, this old, you know, harsh, tyrannical guy, and he has his guards arrest him and throws him in prison. And so now Christ is in prison, and the Inquisitor comes down and says to him, well, you're probably wondering why we threw you in prison, you know, especially given that we're the members of the, you know, we're the representatives of the church that you hypothetically founded. And Christ remains silent through this entire episode. And the Inquisitor basically says, look, you know, you laid down this ethic it's wonderful, but it's superhuman. No one can do it. It's asking way too much. And so the burden you put on people was just far too great. And so what we've done in the Catholic Church in the centuries since the church was founded is we've lightened the load. We've said, well, we take ordinary people and say, well, here's some things you can do to be a little bit better. And, you know, we've instituted confession and repentance and all that. We've kind of toned it down so that the average person has some hope of progress. And we're making headway. And the last bloody thing we need around here is you coming back and like screwing up all our good efforts. It's like, it was nice to have you around once, but once was plenty, man. We don't need you around anymore. And so Christ listens to this, doesn't say anything, and then the Inquisitor turns to leave, and Christ grabs him and kisses him on the lips. And the Inquisitor turns white and then leaves, and when he leaves the door open. And that's the end of the story. And it's an amazing story. It's an absolutely remarkable story in every possible way. And you know, Dostoevsky was objecting to some degree to the tyranny of the Catholic Church, or even of the Christian Church for that matter. But the thing that he did that was so damn brilliant is that he even made the Inquisitor leave the door open. You know, and as a balanced critique of Catholicism, even during the Inquisition, it's so brilliant, it's so emblematic of Dostoevsky's take on the world that he criticized the inquisitorial aspect of Christianity, and of course it's the tyrannical aspect of any belief system, but noted that they bloody well left the door open, right? So it's brilliant, it's brilliant. It's remarkable. So anyways, the whole point that I'm making here is that there are terrible impediments to enlightenment, and the impediments are the necessity of sacrifice and the necessity of the voluntary acceptance of suffering. I mean, you see that in Buddhism, you know, because one of the canons of Buddha, one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism is that life is suffering and that attachment makes it worse. And well, it isn't precisely attachment. It's attachment to things such that you cannot release the things when it's time to let them go, right? So like you're a phoenix, you're 100 years old, your feathers, they're not working anymore, right? You're all wrinkly, you're done. It's time to burst into flames and be reborn, but you don't want to burn off your feathers. You want to cling to them, and that's not good because you have to be willing to undergo that transformation process, and that involves, like, you know, if you take yourself apart because you've made a mistake, and you find out what it is about you that's not set up properly, and that's why the mistake occurred. That's really going to happen, for example, when an intimate relationship breaks down. Then you have to be in a position where you're willing to let the errors that are part of your character, that define you, right? They might even be part of your identity. You have to be willing to let them go. You have to be willing to let them burn off. And that's a hell of a thing to ask. And so then the question might be, well, is there a less radical solution to the problem than crucifixion and resurrection, or the total immolation and regeneration? Because that's the archetypal, that's the archetypal end point, that if you want to put yourself together, you have to die and be reborn. I mean, that motif comes up all the time in popular stories and in mythology. And so here's how I think that problem can be resolved. So let's go back to the Pinocchio story momentarily. So what happens, and the Pinocchio story to me is analogous in its structure to the Sermon on the Mount, and so I'm going to make a parallel between those two things. So basically what the Sermon on the Mount suggests is that you should conceptualize the highest good that you're capable of conceptualizing and orient yourself towards that. and that having done that, you should live in the moment. So it's not like you should live in the moment. It doesn't say that, because that's often Christ the hippie, you know. So the hippies who have adopted that, or that sort of that element of Christianity say, well, you live for the moment, you know. And in meditation and other practices, some of the attempt is to get you to live in the moment. But, you know, just to tell people to live in the moment, it's like, what the hell kind of advice is that? Well, what about the future? You know, that is not helpful advice. Somebody comes to you and they're suffering dreadfully because, you know, their mother has Alzheimer's and they're unemployed. Well, live in the moment. It's like, that's just not helpful. And because it's even worse than that, it's judgmental. You say, well, the only reason you're suffering is because you haven't oriented yourself properly to live in the moment. It's like, no, you're suffering because your mother has Alzheimer's and you don't have a job. It's like, it's not because you aren't living in the moment. So living in the moment isn't the right answer. The right answer is something more like, orient yourself towards the highest good that you can imagine, and then act in the moment. That's a whole different story. Now that's what happens in the Pinocchio story. Basically what happens is that Geppetto sees the star beckoning in the distance, and he orients himself towards the highest good he can imagine. He wants to take this creation of his, and so this is manifesting itself conceptually at multiple levels simultaneously, because there's a story about the destiny of humanity in relationship to God nested in the story. It's like, take your fallible creation, your puppet, and set up the conditions such that it's capable of taking on full functional independence. It's something like that. So that's what you do if you're a good parent with your children. You don't protect them, you don't offer them safety, you don't do any of that except insofar as it's necessary to facilitate their development as fully competent and courageous beings. The purpose of the protection is only to allow that developmental process to continue. So Geppetto orients himself, and so the father orients himself, and then the son undertakes the voyage. And so, all right, so let's say that that's the case. You orient yourself first. Then you can start to rely on then you can start to concentrate more on your orientation to the moment.